All right, let's talk Bible. So God created the world. He put human beings in rulership over his good world. He created a garden. He placed humankind in that garden, and he came and dwelt with humankind in that garden. Adam means human, and male and female, he made them. Adam and Eve, he put them in the garden to rule and tend and cultivate the garden, to order it the way God desires. And then he said, I want you to expand it, take it out beyond the bounds of the garden, beyond the bounds of Eden to the whole world. And I want you to bring order where there's chaos in the world. And I want you to bring my good rule, my loving and wise rule to the whole earth. Well, Adam and Eve failed at that vocation. They failed because they chose to try to grasp power through their own wisdom, through their own understanding of good and evil. In Genesis chapter 2, God plants trees. And he tells Adam, there's two main trees. You can have any tree from the garden you want, including the tree of life, but you cannot eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or the tree of death. And so in Genesis 2, there's two different times. He says, there's two trees, tree of the knowledge of good and evil, tree of life. And then he says, do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But between those two little stanzas in Genesis 2, there's this little story or this little description of a river that flows out from the garden. And it says this one massive river flows out, and then it breaks off into 4 headways. And those 4 headways are actually traveling, those 4 rivers actually flow down into what the Bible describes as the 4 main empires of the scriptures. So those 4 main empires are Jerusalem, Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. So these 4 rivers are describing, in literary terms, in Genesis 2, they are describing the kingdoms and powers of the earth. This is what Jesus came to deal with. See, Jesus' death and resurrection and his ascension to the right hand of the Father is not just for the forgiveness of sin. That is true. It's not just for the defeat of evil. That is true. It's not just for the defeat of death, that we may have eternal life with Christ here on the earth when he returns. That is true. But it's also that Jesus came to turn the powers of the earth upside down. And that simply means he came to show us what it means to truly rule with God's love and wisdom righteously in the earth. And so these kingdoms represent 4 different kings or thrones, kind of like a Game of Thrones. This represents 4 thrones in the earth and in the Bible that describe how power is played out in the world. And Jesus comes and faces these powers. And he stands before Pilate in Rome, and ultimately the power of Caesar in Rome. And Pilate asks him, are you a king? And Jesus said, in the Aramaic, it's basically like, these words are yours, or it is as you say. But what was he asking him? He was asking him, are you Lord, or is Caesar Lord? And the center of the gospel, the good news about Jesus, is that Jesus is Lord. See, if you walked up to somebody on the streets of Jerusalem in the first century and said, hey, you're a sinner who needs forgiveness, that's not controversial. It is true that Jesus forgives sin through his death and resurrection. But what's controversial is that you would say Jesus is Lord, so Caesar is not. If Jesus is Lord of the world, that is the most controversial statement you could have made in the ancient world. Because the Caesars ruled. The Caesars allowed the Israelites, God's people, through Jesus, he allowed them to worship whatever gods they wanted. In fact, that was not controversial at all. Caesar was like, hey, listen, you Israelites can worship whatever little gods you want to. But Caesar is Lord. There's nobody but Caesar. And so the disciples and the apostles and Jesus himself were killed because they were proclaiming a new king. They were proclaiming that the king of the world was Jesus, not Caesar. And so we see this power struggle all the way back to Genesis 2. This massive river that flows out of Eden and then breaks off into 4 headways, or the Hebrew word for generals. It is the picture of the 4 empires that are tested. All human beings get tested. We're tested in how we will rule. We are tested by God in how we will take the authority and order that God has given to us to righteously order his world the way he wants. This is the test. And so all the way back to Genesis 2, we see that God is desiring to test the powers of the earth, the human beings who will rule over his good creation. He tests us to see, where is our heart? Will it be with Jesus? Will it be with him as God of the universe? Will it be under his wisdom and under his perfect self-sacrificial love? Or will we define it on our own terms? Will we define good and evil on our own terms? Will we order God's world our way, which only comes to corruption, sin, and death? So that is the four rivers in Genesis 2. Really important literary use of these headways to describe not just the physical, the geographical makeup of the garden and what flows out of the garden, but it's describing the powers of the world, how we go corrupt without God's good rule, and how Jesus came to not only defeat sin and death, but evil and corrupt rulership. He defeats the dark powers that are behind these rulers who try to rule on their own. And that is all humanity, because the Bible describes us as king priests. This is what God called Israel to be in Exodus 19. He said, I want you to be my king priests. I want you to represent me to all of the nations as king priests, as the royal priesthood. I want you to represent my good, loving, wise rule to the rest of the world, all the nations. And Jesus was the ultimate human who came to demonstrate that. All other human beings have failed at that. But Jesus came and ruled perfectly. He ruled wisely and righteously. And he demonstrated to us what that looked like. So now Jesus has not only forgiven us, he's not only defeated evil and death so that we can have eternal life, but he's actually restored us to the place that we can rule like God wanted in the beginning. He's restored us to the place that we can rule with God's wisdom and love, but we can only do it through Christ. We can only do it in him and with him. This is Ephesians chapter 1. We have been seated with Christ in heavenly places. This is the language of the ascension after Jesus' death. He's seated at the right hand of the Father. The right hand of the Father is the position of power. Genesis 49, he's been, verse 10 and 11, he's been given the scepter of the kingdoms. Psalm chapter 2, he is the wise king who would come and rule over the nations, and we are seated with him. So Jesus came not only to forgive sin, but to restore us to the place that we could wisely and lovingly rule over God's good creation with him.